I think we'll start. So thank you everyone. I guess most of you have not seen me before because I'm on a fellowship, so I'm not teaching this year. But my name is Pratish Bihuria. I'm a senior lecturer in the department in politics, governance, and development. So many of you may be in Tom Labor's course as well, that just ended. So that is one of the reasons why we're having the GDI lecture a bit later than usual. But we're very lucky today to have two speakers that have influenced a lot of the work at Manchester, particularly the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Center, where Joe also, I think, was involved with Tom Labor's Social Protection Project as well. So today is also a celebration because it's a book launch, although the book was published 2 years ago, I guess. So maybe one of your last book launches. So the book is called From Development to Democracy, the Transformation of Modern Asia, published by Princeton University Press. So what I'll do now is just introduce both our speakers, and then Dan will speak, and then Joe will speak, and then we'll take comments and questions. So Professor Dan Slater is the James Orrin Murfin Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. You have definitely read his work on systemic vulnerability in your classes, which he co-authored with Richard Donner and Brad Slater in 2005. But you may have also, I'd likely to have read his book called Ordering Power, Contentious Politics and Authoritarian Leviathans in Southeast Asia. And Joseph Wong is the Vice President International at the University of Toronto, our partner university, actually at the University of Manchester. He has a dual appointment as Professor in Political Science and the Monk School of Global Affairs of Public Policy. And he previously held the Canada Research Chair in Democratization, Health and Development. He has previously published several books, including Healthy Democracy and Welfare Politics in Taiwan and South Korea, and Betting on Biotech Innovation and the Limits of Asia's Developmental State, which I'll be reading later this year in book club.
Oh,
Lindsay.
Do you want some extra copies? I have like 50.
Okay, so over to you guys.
Great. Thanks, Pratish. Well, thanks everybody for coming out at this time. It's really nighttime here at 5 o'clock this time of year, right? It's almost like the dead of night. Great to see so many people here interested in the topic. So this is a book that we published in 2022, so it's been out for a little while, but hopefully still relevant. We're going to give a relatively brief, kind of a somewhat abbreviated version of the talk, just because the book is now out and available, and maybe you've seen it, or you can go see it in case there's anything that we leave out. But just going to briefly scoot through kind of the main argument and what we try to accomplish in the book. So a basic overview of it. So the setting for the book is what we call developmental Asia. So for those of you who work on Asian politics, you probably know that there's a tendency to divide the region by cardinal directions. So there's East Asia, there's Northeast Asia, there's Southeast Asia, there's South Asia, there's Central Asia, there's all these cardinal Asias, right? And the argument we make is that developmental Asia is actually an identifiable historical region, which is defined not so much just by where it is on a map, but by its political economy and by a particular approach to development, which really began in Japan with the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, and a sort of approach, kind of market regarding, but very much state involved, export oriented, a lot of emphasis on technological transformation, upgrade, and the like. And so there's quite a range of outcomes in this region, but we argue that all 12 of these cases in both Northeast and Southeast Asia essentially followed in those footsteps to greater or lesser degrees. Okay, and the puzzle in the region is, so of course, lots and lots of economic development, but much less democratization, although not none. I think people often look at Asia and they say, well, Asia means China means dictatorship, so Asia's got all this development and no democracy. But it's actually more evenly split. Among the 12 cases, 6 of the 12 have at one time or another experimented with democratic reforms, to a substantial degree. So what we try to do is to examine developmental Asia's uneven democratization experience, and we're going to argue it's a clustered experience, so that there are, rather than thinking in terms of Northeast and Southeast Asia, there are identifiable developmental clusters in the region which associate with whether or not they democratize. And we look at it from a historical perspective. And the main argument we make is that in developmental Asia, the primary mode of democratization has been democracy through strength. And in fact, until the very last second, the title of the book was Democracy Through Strength. So this is something you should be prepared for if you ever write books, is that your editors, your publishers might decide you have a different title for your book than you do. And so they said, no, actually the book is, we're going to call it The Transformations of Modern Asia. And I said, what does that mean? Like, what's modern Asia? Like, we never use that term in the book. Like, what is that? It's like, no, that really, we're going to call it The Transformations of Modern Asia. And I said, no, you're not. And they said, no, we are. And so I said, well, can you give us, like, any time to find another title? So our second choice title was for Developments of Democracy, but they insisted on the subtitle. They said, well, the subtitle is Transformations of Modern Asia. Like, fine, just make it the subtitle, it's fine. But that was not our choice. So if you're like offended by the title, or you're like, what is that supposed to mean? Like, I'm from Pakistan. Is that modern Asia? Like, don't at me with that. I don't even know. So that's on Princeton, not on us. So here's kind of the puzzle that we sort of open with in the book. So how does authoritarianism end? And there's two very, very different ways that it can end. So democracy can arise through weakness or through strength. So the weakness of an authoritarian regime or the strength of an authoritarian regime. So these are two images from almost the exact same moment in history, from basically the mid to late 1980s, and we have two examples of democratization. And on the left, what we have is the people power movement in the Philippines, when the Marcos regime was toppled by, it was the first movement ever be called a people power movement. Okay, and this is almost 40 years ago now. And very, very small. She's small in real life too, or was small. Corazon Aquino's taking her oath of office, and she is basically there was a stolen election, there was a coup, Marcos regime collapses, and as the headline indicates, Marcos flees into exile. Right. So this is, I think, kind of accords with our usual view of how democracy happens. An authoritarian regime collapses. It's kind of having its death throes. It's on its deathbed, and so some kind of final, like the military turns against them or the public turns against them, and then finally this rickety old, crumbly old dictatorship finally collapses. Right. And most of our theories, we could talk. If you're interested in theory, we could talk more about it in Q&A. But basically, our theories of democratization kind of explain democratization this way. It's what happens when authoritarian regimes weaken. They weaken and they collapse. But the example on the right was also a case of democratization, almost the same time, South Korea. This is No Tae-woo. And if the picture had been taken of him a couple years before, he would have been wearing a military uniform rather than his very snappy suit. And so what happened in South Korea was the regime did not collapse. What happened was the regime calculated that it would have good prospects under democracy. They conceded democracy, but they did not concede defeat. And the old ruling party, of which No Tae-woo was one of the leaders, ran in elections and won the presidency. So this is a case of democracy rose, and the authoritarian regime conceded democracy from a position of strength. Now, most people, I think like, well, the one on the left, like, that's democratization. The people rose, the people overthrew the regime, right? And on the right, it's like, well, I don't know, that's maybe liberalization, or it's like it's like old wine in new bottles. Like, that's not really democratization, right? Just the regime just held elections, but it's still the same people, right? But I would argue, like, we're 40 years beyond this. I don't think anybody would argue that the Philippines is a more functional or a more democratic place than South Korea, right? So the point is that what happened on the right, so democracy through strength is really democratization, okay? It's not necessarily better, it's not necessarily worse, but it is a different mode through which democracy comes about, and we would argue has not been terribly well theorized. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to turn over to Joe. He's going to tell us a little bit about how we theorize it.
Great, thank you. So let me go back a little bit. Writing a book with a dear friend is something that is really an amazing experience, and we actually, Dan and I, got to know one another because we shared an instinct in terms of how democracy seemed to be emerging in Asia and really rethinking what the modal pathway of democratic transition was. It was actually probably about 15 years ago, we were both at a conference in Taiwan, and Dan had just written a piece on strong state democratization for the Journal of Democracy on Malaysia and Singapore. And I had been thinking about Taiwan more and more in terms of as an example of democracy through strength. And so we ended up meeting. We obviously knew of each other for a long time, given our work, but we had never actually collaborated. And we started talking about the Taiwan case, which in many ways was the exemplary case. And then probably about 2 months later, we found ourselves in Madison, Wisconsin, and we wrote the first article version of this book that came out in 2013. And over the course of a weekend, I think we probably threw down about 18,000 words. It just rolled off our tongues or off our fingertips because it was an argument that in many ways had been so well formulated in our minds. And essentially, in the case of Taiwan, what we see is, and this is really our exemplary case or example of democracy through strength, you have in 1986, you have the opposition, which had been emerging and stirring. It was really an intellectual movement of students, of professors, and of independent candidates who were contesting local elections at that time. And in 1986, this emergent opposition forms or proclaims the formation of an opposition political party. Now, you have to go back to 1986 to really appreciate how significant this was. It was significant in large part because Taiwan was under martial law at that time. And it was ruled really brutally and with an autocratic iron fist. That was the KMT of the ruling regime at that time. So most observers of Taiwanese politics at that time assumed that the KMT would do as the KMT had always done, and as what we assume autocratic regimes will do, was to crush the opposition, was to make this proclamation something that the opposition movement would be punished for. But instead, the KMT actually allowed the formation of this party. And shortly thereafter, in 1987, lifted martial law. Supplementary elections were held in 88 and 89, full legislative elections in 92, and founding presidential elections in 96, in which the KMT candidate, interestingly, wins resoundingly. Right? And so to Dan's point, this was an incumbent autocratic regime conceding political liberalization and democratization, but not conceding defeat. And the reason why I was able to do this was because, and this is very much, this is a book really about development and democracy. It's because we argue that the KMT, or the incumbent regime, had what was a really extraordinary record of economic development. Taiwan, after all, in the early post-war period, by most measures, was an economic basket case. And by the time of the 1980s, it was rapidly climbing industrial and global value chain. It had rapidly economically developed. Incomes had doubled, tripled, and so forth. The distribution of income actually in Taiwan was relatively egalitarian as well. In other words, you had a ruling party that had ruled with an iron fist, but that had nonetheless been at the helm of what we call the developmental state cluster, or a developmental state model, in which then, by virtue of an extraordinary track record, or an economic track record, and an extraordinary record of poverty reduction, which the regime claimed to have been at the helm of, it provided for this regime a fair degree of confidence. Right? Autocratic regimes will only democratize from a position of strength if it is confident that by democratizing it will A, be relatively assured of victory. In the case of the KMT, because it was the exemplary case, it was almost assured of victory, and it did. But also stability confidence, that by democratizing, you weren't going to invite the kind of instability that we see, for instance, in the Philippines, but rather that you could concede a democratic transition and the political economy would remain relatively stable, so that development and this record of development could continue relatively unabated. Right? And so regimes that would consider a democracy through strength scenario are regimes that are ultimately confident that they would likely win and that that democratic transition would likely be stable, or that there would be a fair degree of stability that would continue throughout. So this is really a way of introducing than the 10 chapters of the book. And I'm not going to go through all of these chapters, but rather just use this table of contents as just to give you a sense of the coverage that we offer in the book, but also to share with you a couple of authorial choices that Dan and I made, very deliberate choices. You know, when you're writing a book-length manuscript, for those of you who've written them, you know that you're constantly making decisions, analytical decisions, authorial decisions in terms of how you want to lay out the argument, how you want to tell the story. And when you have two authors who are, you know, strong-willed in many ways and you know, have a pretty clear sense of what it is that we want to convey, there's a lot of discussions about how we want to actually lay out what in the end was about 125,000 words. So I just want to share with you a couple of the authorial decisions. Before we go to the next slide, though, I just want to point out, I want to share with you a couple of the authorial decisions so that you just get a sense again of the argument, the broader argument that we're making. You will note that, you know, we have our first two chapters there, which are where we lay out the argument, where we lay out the broader theoretical framework that we employ, where we talk about clusters, which Dan will talk a little bit more about in the last part of this presentation. But you'll notice that the case that actually was the one that drove our argument in the first place, right? The case from which we inductively generated our theory, if you will, of democracy through strength, the Taiwan case, is not the first case that we present. We actually made a very conscious decision to begin with the Japanese case for a variety of reasons. One, because it's a hard case to make, and we wanted to be sure, you know, we wanted to stress test our theory earlier on. It was also, we chose the Japanese case because it is oftentimes presumed, quite willy-nilly, that democracy, at least post-war democracy in Japan, was externally imposed. That it was as though in the immediate post-war period, Japan, in the throes of defeat, was so politically prostrate that it had absolutely no political agency at all, and that democracy was essentially externally imposed by the U.S. occupation. Now, we want to be very clear that obviously the American occupation is an absolutely critical and necessary part of the story. We don't want to dispute that at all. But when we revisited the Japanese case, because Japan provides such a model for the rest of developmental Asia, if you will, particularly the developmental status cluster, we wanted to see if there were other lessons that could be learned from the Japanese case. And I'm not going to go into too much of the details, but essentially the argument we make is that actually a lot of the kind of democratic residue in the post-war period was a result of a lot of earlier democratic experience that had been made, experiments that had been made during the 1920s and 1930s during the era of Taisho democracy, which obviously ultimately fails and succumbs to fascism, and there are a whole host of institutional weaknesses that explain that. But the invention of political parties, for instance, emerges in the 1920s and 1930s. The notion of electoral competition as a means of determining who will govern and what legitimacy means in terms of what that governing will be also emerges in the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s. Again, all of this falls by the wayside as the forces of fascism ultimately prevail and takes Japan in a very different direction. But nonetheless, the institutional antecedents were laid prior to any American occupation. What's also interesting is that as we look back and look very closely at the historical text describing the period between 1945 and ultimately to 1955, but really 1945 to 1948, is that you see actually what we've described as Andrew Gordon, Japanese historian, describes as the passing through of conservatives, conservative elites that had survived, if you will, the post-war trials and purges and so forth. But you have a class of Japanese conservative elites that pass through and in fact become the de facto incumbent ruling governing class, if you will, in the immediate post-war period. Indeed, the Americans did write the Constitution that was eventually adopted in 1946, but the first time that a constitutional draft was actually made was when the Americans went to the Japanese conservative legal experts and said, you draft the first constitution. And the constitution they drafted, actually, which should be no surprise, was essentially the Meiji Constitution again. These were not Democrats per se, right? These were those conservatives that still had a little bit of the, obviously, the democratic experimentation of the 1920s and 30s, but also some of the kind of conservatism that was really questionable. But nonetheless, as the institutions of practice of democracy were introduced, in 1947, when the American reverse course policy took place, and essentially you saw the left being slowly undermined by the change in American foreign policy, it became increasingly clear, and this is the punchline, that democracy made political sense to the conservatives. It was incentive compatible for these conservatives who otherwise, if left on their own, would have just simply redone the Meiji Constitution, but actually found that democracy benefited them. And in fact, democratic practices was incentive compatible with their interests, which of course is to stay in power. And so in the end, what you have are conservatives that lead Japan's democratization and in fact have a significant hand in ultimately institutionalizing Japanese democracy. So you can go into the details in the book, but again, we wanted to begin this book with what we saw as being a really hard case, but one that we could nonetheless legitimately and being empirically true to the material make the argument that this was an example of democracy and conservative-led democracy through strength. And then we go into the then we go into the Taiwan chapter, which I've already talked a little bit about. Dan's already alluded to the South Korean case as well. And whereas in the case of Taiwan, the KMT was very confident that if it were to concede democracy and concede founding elections, it would remain in power. When Jiang Jingguo, who was at that time the incumbent president and dictator, when he began the process of conceding democracy, there was nowhere in his life that he assumed the KMT would ever lose power. And to his deathbed, he assumed that even with conceding democracy, the KMT would remain in power. And indeed, to his deathbed, they did stay in power, right? Because in many ways, there were very important signals for the KMT to be very confident, both in terms of victory confidence and stability confidence. And Dan and I are very careful in saying that not all these regimes are created equally. That democracy through strength, while it may hew to a specific pattern in the exemplary case of Taiwan, South Korea is another example of democracy through strength, but where the incumbent regime was not nearly as strong, and therefore not nearly as confident as the KMT was. And so, as Dan pointed out, Noh Tae-woo concedes presidential elections in the summer of 1987, concedes that these presidential elections will be held that December, invites then, who had been the historically jailed opposition leaders Kim Dae-jung and Kim Yong-sam to run as well. And the incumbent regime essentially banked on the opposition splitting the opposition vote. So yes, Noh Tae-woo wins the presidency, but barely. He certainly doesn't win a majority, he only wins a plurality of the vote, and we also know that if Kim Yong-sam and Kim Dae-jung had in fact allied their forces together, the opposition would have won. So this is an example of a regime that had relative confidence that the opposition would split the vote, and they were right in that regard, but not nearly the kind of confidence that we see in the KMT. So this was a strong regime. It was an example of democracy through strength, but as Dan and I argue, there's a spectrum of strength. There are those that are much more confident and much higher, with much more strength than there was than in the case of like South Korea. The last thing I'll say, and I'll touch on this in the case of China, and then I'll turn it back to Dan to take us through the cluster analysis. The elephant in the room, obviously, is when we talk about China. And thankfully, Princeton never asked us to write a book about China, although it seems to be the thing to do these days. We insisted that the cover could not be red, nor could it have a dragon on it. And that also seems to sell or be quite prevalent. But we need to obviously address the case of China, and this is something that Dan and I set out to do from the very beginning. And in the article version, which came out in 2013, we do allude to, well, what does all of this mean with regards to China? And so we originally thought, again, in terms of authorial choices, we would write a chapter on China, just as we had written one on South Korea, on Taiwan, on Japan. Anyway, the China case became too unwieldy, too large, too complex. And so we wrote essentially a full chapter on China alone, and then we write a chapter on a developmental socialism in which China is heavily featured. But we wanted to write a chapter on China that actually took us to 1989, and there's a reason why we wanted to take the analysis to 1989. And that is because, contrary to what a lot of observers might surmise, which is to say June 4th, 1989 was an example of a regime, an autocratic regime, that was strong and chose to repress as autocratic regimes do. The argument we make actually is that it's actually not the proper way to think about China in 1989. That there is a bit of we need to re-historicize, if you will, where China was in 1989. And we make the argument that in June of 1989, in fact, the regime was too weak to concede. After all, consider this was a regime that was only half a generation removed from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. This was a China whose economy was not nearly as strong as it is now. We often think of the Chinese economy as being obviously one of the world's largest, but in 1989, this was prior to the Southern Tour of Deng Xiaoping in 1992. The real reforms begin and accelerate in 93. The accession to the WTO, which again increases China's developmental capacity by an order of magnitude, doesn't happen until the early 2000s. 1989 was 10 years after the initial opening reform. So China, the regime was not particularly strong at that time. There were deep elite factional splits within the regime, and there's more and more that you can uncover seemingly daily highlighting that. So the point that we make here is that actually in June 4th, 1989, this was not a regime that was a strong regime that chose to repress, but in fact it was a regime that was too weak to consider a democracy through strength scenario, which, sort of foreshadowing the argument that we make in the subsequent chapter in the book, in which I'll leave off right now, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, we do make the argument that China today is a very strong case for democracy through strength, and that it ought to have, as a regime, the kind of victory confidence and stability confidence that the KMT had before that a generation earlier on. For a whole host of reasons, however, we argue that while theoretically China is a very strong candidate case, empirically there are a whole host of reasons as to why this remains unlikely and improbable. And we can talk a little bit more about that in discussion, but that would be the way in which we treat China theoretically versus how we think about China empirically. And why don't I use that as a way of turning it back to Dan, who will take us then through the conversations around the various clusters.
Right, thanks. So the one thing that we kind of became clear to us as we worked through the book and through the different cases is that they weren't just sort of 12 unique individual cases, but that in fact they could be pretty meaningfully clustered into 4 different families or different clusters of cases, if you will. And the real, I think, in one way, one of the real kind of aha moments of the project was when we realized that these varieties of Asian developmentalism correlate basically perfectly with whether or not they're going to pursue democratic reform to some time or another. So what we have here, so as Joe's been talking about, mostly the developmental status cluster of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, and then China, like after the Southern Tour, and as China then begins to embark on again a sort of, loosely Meiji-style export-led development model, like following the developmental status pathway, starts launching what's essentially a new cluster of cases, the developmental socialist cases, which have very real differences, right, in terms of ruling single parties and in terms of the legacies of state socialism for sure, and in China's case also the legacy of techno-nationalism and the technological development. Even when China was struggling economically, was still in some ways a technological powerhouse. And then we have the developmental Britannia cluster, Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong, the developmental militarist cluster of Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar. And again, so the interesting thing here, so from a modernization theory perspective, the richer you are, the more likely you are to democratize, and that works quite well with the developmental status cluster. Like that, those three cases fit modernization theory quite nicely, but the developmental Britannia cluster does not, because these cases, these are all very high capacity, wealthy cases, but all three of these places tried to avoid democratic reforms. And then the developmental militarist cluster, one of the poorest ones. So again, we might think from modernization theory perspective, not likely to experiment with democratic reforms, but all three did. Now, they've been reversed in Thailand and Myanmar, which might then lead you to, again, if you're a modernization theorist, you might say, well, they're just that actually accords with the theory, but doesn't really explain why they attempted democratic reforms in the first place. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of some of the main takeaways from these clusters. So rather than writing 12 whole chapters, the idea is to, once we get away from those Northeast Asian cases, talk about the clusters as a group. So with the developmental militarist cluster, the main argument here is that Indonesia has enjoyed more democratic success than either Myanmar or Thailand since the turn of the millennium because of the inherited strength of party and state institutions built up during Suharto's authoritarian New Order during the previous millennium. So the idea here is that Indonesia had more substantial, so developmental success economically, although with Thailand is pretty close, but certainly stronger state and a stronger ruling party than existed in either Thailand or Myanmar. And so that's been the foundation of the stability confidence. So Indonesia just had elections, I think it's the sixth election since they democratized, another peaceful transfer of power yet again. And the military does not see any need to move back in, as in Thailand or Myanmar. And part of the reason why is because, again, some of these old guard politicians from the past, and based on the developmental track record, relatively conservative, moderate politicians win power. And so the military doesn't have the same need to feel they have to intervene in politics. So even within these clusters, there's a real spectrum of cases. They're not triplets, right? So you go from some cases that have higher capacity, stronger developmental track record, stronger political institutions than others. So Indonesia is kind of the strongest in the militarist cluster. In Britannia, it's certainly Singapore, right? And so in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong, the pattern has been democracy avoidance, not democracy through strength. But then we see the disastrous cost of delay for political stability and for the authoritarian incumbents themselves in Malaysia and Hong Kong, okay? Whereas Singapore's authoritarian order remains in much stronger shape. So the most common question we get about this argument is like, well, why would you ever take the risk? You're a strong authoritarian regime. You're able to stay in power. You're not being forced from power. So why would you ever take the risk? And here, I think you can see that some of these cases, and in a way, it took us longer to finish the book than we expected, but in some ways it was fortuitous because we were able to see in three cases in particular what happens when you avoid reform. Because in Malaysia, in Hong Kong, and in Cambodia, all three of these cases were strong enough in the 2000s, without question, if they simply leveled the playing field, opened up the process, democratized, they would have continued to win power. They were popular enough to keep winning. But by avoiding reform, they went past their apex of power, they began to decline, and they reached a point where it was either repress or concede defeat. Malaysia winds up conceding defeat. They get voted out of power. The old ruling party is now kind of a basket case. And in both Cambodia and Hong Kong, they crack down. So basically realizing they can no longer win anything even resembling free and fair elections, just much, much more repression. Okay, so there's a lot less political stability. These are, again, the best window of opportunity for Malaysia, Hong Kong, and Cambodia to actually have the same kind of glide path to democracy and development that Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia all had. They kind of missed that window, and once it was gone, it was gone. Okay, and again, to Joe's point about South Korea, keep in mind, so when they democratized, they split the opposition, right? That also happened in Indonesia. Okay, so in Indonesia, once they opened, the main reason that the opposition to the authoritarian regime was so united was because it was an authoritarian regime. As soon as they democratized, then they have different views on political Islam. They have different views on all kinds of things. And so the best way to make sure your opponents are unified is to be a dictator. Okay? The moment you democratize, you basically take away the main thing holding them together. Okay, so there are all kinds of reasons. I think these cases help exemplify why it's a strategic choice to democratize when you're strong, as opposed to waiting until things get way worse. And then finally, the developmental socialist cluster. So again, so China, they reform, they start kind of launching this cluster, and by the 2010s, so all three of these developmental socialist cases had become viable candidates to pursue democracy through strength. China, of course, is the strongest candidate of all, but as in the developmental Britannia cluster, none have done so. So if the developmental militarist cluster was not too underdeveloped to experiment with democratic reforms, neither is the developmental socialist cluster. So we don't think a pure modernization explanation makes sense of this. We don't think it's just a question of a lack of capacity. We think it's something to do with the mode of development. So again, what modernization theory tells you is levels of development explain regime type, right? And what we're saying is no, actually types of development explain regime type, which just makes a lot more intuitive sense, right? So why would levels explain types? Types should explain types. So we get a lot of leverage on the kind of whether or not countries experiment with democracy or not based on the type of economic development that they pursue. And I should just say, this book is, in this way, I like the title. The book really is as much about the developmental track records of these cases as democratization. And as we open the book, we sort of say, economic development is Asia's inescapable fact. Right? Any book that didn't pay attention to the fact that all of these places are obsessed with economic catch-up. They're obsessed with economic development. It's the issue, in a way, right? So just to talk about democracy as if it had nothing to do with the economy just wouldn't really ring true. So the way it winds up then is in this interesting pattern in which you've got these, again, there's this real spectrum of strength. The cases with the highest strength are a mix. So the greens all democratized. The ones in blue all avoided democracy through strength. And then in the lower part, these more intermediate cases, so weaker cases, but still, compared to most authoritarian regimes around the world, quite strong. The militarist cluster pursued these reforms, the socialist cluster didn't. So here we see this kind of interesting mix of support for modernization theory, but again, we think levels of development are not nearly as helpful as thinking about types of development. So just a few conclusions from the book. So people often think of this region as ill-suited for democratization due to some kind of cultural argument. So, like West is West and East is East. Democracy is a Western invention. Why would it ever go to Asia? Well, of course, half the cases have done it. So we argue, if you set aside these sort of Asian values arguments, that these cases are actually quite well-suited for democracy through strength because of the strong institutions and economic track records that they've developed. We also suggest that this modal pathway, democracy through strength, is actually in some ways more comparable to older European cases of democratization than as opposed to similar young democracies. We also sort of underscore, if those of you interested in studying authoritarianism, that the institutions and the policies and the developmental track records of these regimes it's about a lot more than just whether a regime collapses or survives, right? That's by far not the only outcome of interest here, right? Another thing that these things really matter for is whether or not a regime is capable of conceding reforms in a stabilizing way or if it will be destabilizing. Again, a la the Philippines example, right? Also, I think we're in this era of democratic recession, democratic backsliding, and I think a lot of it hinges on a lack of confidence that democracy and stability can go together. So to the extent that we can find ways in which countries can democratize and remain stable, we think it opens the door to hopefully regimes being a little bit more risk accepted and realizing there's risks in not reforming just as there are risks in reforming. And then last but far from least, we suggest that in the concluding chapter that we do think democracy is a universal value, but it's not the ultimate ends of politics. So basically, democracy needs to fulfill deeper needs for peace and prosperity, or it's going to always be endangered. And so this is not a Western story or an Eastern story. Basically, anywhere, democracy pretty much always is a secondary interest to questions of economic development and stability. So you want to say a couple last things before we turn over?
Yeah. Go back to the slide. Just a couple of additional points. That last point there is really, I think, it appears in the conclusion, but it's really woven throughout the whole book. We state it most clearly in the conclusion that democracy is a universal value, but it's not the ultimate value. The ultimate value, in the end, remains development, peace and prosperity, and so forth. And so, to the extent that we see democracy, being challenged, including just south of my border in Canada, where Dan lives, I mean, one of the reasons why we see, some of the fissures now being opened and threatened in in established democracies is precisely actually a question around development and the extent to which development, peace, prosperity, and shared development can continue. And so, in some of the work that Dan and I have written on, well, then what happens in these post-democracy constraint scenarios, the piece we wrote on authoritarian successor parties, for instance, is the importance of stability and moderation, right? And really what's quite remarkable in these cases that have been successful is that these incumbent autocratic regimes ultimately become not only quite moderate politically, but they also become quite moderate in terms of their developmental policies as well, in terms of social policy, etc. And so stability, as Dan pointed out, stability in the end becomes increasingly even more important, right? And so when we talk about victory confidence and stability confidence, it shouldn't be a surprise that stability confidence is so critical. And indeed, one of the things about the developmental militarist cluster, we were in the field in Myanmar in the early period of the latest era of democratic experiments, and we saw, and had we written and finished the book when we told Princeton we would finish the book, we would have completely had a different set of conclusions. But we did see the military come back in because that's what militaries do. They're obsessed about stability and instability, and it's not surprising, again, when we think about it that way. The last thing I'll say is just about China, and just to put a finer point on why we think China is an ideal candidate case now, and that it needs to be thinking about this scenario of democracy through strength rather than avoiding it. One is Dan has cautioned that the longer you wait, the more likely you are to become an embittered autocrat, and we see plenty of empirical evidence of that. Second thing is that we often hear from our Chinese friends and interlocutors, as well as analysts, that the CCP wants to avoid the fate of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That the lessons that they learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union is that if you democratize, you invite instability, and you invite ultimately the collapse of your own regime. And what our book essentially argues, both implicitly and we do make explicit reference to this as well, is that that's exactly the wrong lesson to learn from the Soviet experience. In fact, if there's any lesson that you should learn from the Soviet experience, is that if you wait too long to democratize, if you wait until you are well past your apex of power, that you then run the risk of inviting precisely the kind of instability and also the very high likelihood that you will be defeated if not made completely politically obsolete, as we see with the CPSU. In other words, when Glasnost and Perestroika are launched, these are not liberalizing reforms, but rather these are reforms that reveal the rot that is endemic within the ruling party, demonstrating its weakness, not its strength. And so if there's a lesson to be learned from the Soviet example, it is that you should concede, if democracy through strength is ever in the cards, you should concede well before your best before date expires. And that means then that the stronger you are, the more confidence you have, and so forth, is precisely the time in which you ought to consider democratizing, which we argue China is in that very ideal bittersweet spot now. It reveals ultimately, and this is the last thing I'll say, the core paradox of this book, which is that when authoritarian regimes are strong enough to concede democracy, it's also the time where they're least likely, because they're strong enough, or at least perceive themselves to be strong enough to retain their autocratic control. So, as Dan has noted, it's a strategic choice. It's a decision. It comes with it risks. But as we show in the book, the modal pathway of stable democratization in the region actually is democracy through strength, not the opposite. So why don't we end it there and open it up for questions. Thank you.